You're very welcome to the show, Linden. How you doing, mate?
Great to be here.
To dive straight in, how much of the unbelievably horrific behavior of the Black and Tans can we attribute to Henry Hugh Tudor, who at the time was the de facto like chief of police?
He was a commander. The Black and Tans were there ahead of him. They were there sort of early 1920 when the IRA began to intimidate the police, who were mostly Irishmen, and began to murder them and began to intimidate their families and began to organize little boycotts in the communities. And gradually it had its effect where the police were bailing out of the RIC in large numbers. The British government came up with the bright idea, well, we'll replace them with Englishmen, basically, because we can't really depend on the Irish going forward, and we're going to bring in some hard-nosed individuals. So as of early 1920, they were actively and successfully recruiting unemployed former British Army soldiers from veterans of the First World War. Some of these people were just unemployed and looking for work. Some of them were suffering from what they used to call shell shock. They had PTSD problems, brutalized by an ugly war, and a lot of them came over with a very negative attitude towards the Irish. They thought the Irish were traitors during the First World War, whereas in fact the Irish people sent three separate infantry divisions to the First World War to fight for the British. Anyway, a lot of these Black and Tans moved in the first part of the 1920s, and they were settling in and they were establishing a very rough kind of law enforcement. They were in there with a vengeance, and so that by the time Tudor got there in mid 1920, the Black and Tans were already established. They had the reputation, they had the label, and they had a real head start on the reputation for ruthlessness and violence and just wild police tactics, ambush and murder. So Tudor comes in. Tudor was quite noted in the British Army for his disciplinary ethos and the fact that soldiers were supposed to behave like according to the rules of war, such as they were, and I think I'm sure he was briefed before he got there that he was going to be dealing with a police force that had taken on a completely different character from the RIC of the old days. And he was only there a couple of weeks when one of his senior officers was writing a letter to Dublin Castle and talking about the new approach to anti-rebel tactics would involve murder. And he wasn't sure that murder of terrorism directed against terrorists was going to work, but that's what they were going to do. So very quickly, Tudor, this was only a week or two after he got there, very quickly he and his team had taken on this new approach, which was essentially to harness all the worst instincts and all the worst behavior of the Black and Tans and turn it against the Irish Republican Army, the Irish Volunteers. And that essentially is what they did by early June, by the 6th or 7th of June. He's in London in a private dinner with the Prime Minister of Britain. Sure, that's a lot of progress for a guy just new on the job. He's sitting down to dinner with Lloyd George and one of Lloyd George's closest confidants. And Lloyd George the next day in cabinet reported on this dinner. And it was a pretty bloody-minded dinner. Tudor laid out, here's what we got to do, and we want your backing. And Lloyd George basically says, you'll get my backing. You'll get everything you ask for to make this work. So as of June, what was considered to be outlaw behavior by the Black and Tans became orthodox, and it became the principal tactic of the British through the agency of the Royal Irish Constabulary.
I remember what you said there was interesting about a lot of those Black and Tans were World War One veterans, and at this stage they were still unemployed. This could definitely be indicative of of someone who was maybe too volatile or too violent to integrate back into society, too traumatized. Not that they would even have, they call it shell shock back then. Yeah.
Well, as a Cork man, you know that in March of that year, the police murdered the mayor of Cork, and who was also an IRA brigade officer. But they murdered him in his own home in front of his family because this was to teach them a lesson because a couple of RIC had been killed around Cork. So they said, okay, this is how they get back. Now, this was a couple of months before Tudor got there. But they showed up on his doorstep. They had, according to one of the witnesses, they had funny accents. And this witness was an Irish woman. So she would not have considered any Irish accent to be a funny accent. So she must have been referring to English accents. So as early as March, they were playing hardball in Cork, which was, as you know, the center of the whole insurgency. And by the time Tudor got there, he would have known that, and he would not have had a bit of any problem with it.
Interesting. Something in the book. Sorry, the book you wrote. Give us the title there, if you could, please.
The title?
Please.
An Accidental Villain: A Soldier's Tale of War, Deceit, and Exile.
Very good. You mentioned in the book, I obviously before his time in Ireland, Tudor was a part of the second Boer War in Africa. And would I be correct in saying that like some of the tactics used by his side of the Boer War were the type that he was fighting against in Ireland, right?
Yeah, the Boers more or less invented the kind of insurgency that the IRA perfected, and he would have, as a British officer, he would have been familiar, but his experience in that particular part of the Boer War was brief because he was almost killed a couple of weeks after he got there in an artillery barrage. So he spent a lot of it in the hospital, and then after he got out of the hospital, he spent a lot of it sort of behind the lines, working in the office, basically. But it's interesting that his relationship with Winston Churchill was quite active at that time, because Churchill was running around South Africa supposedly as a journalist, but carrying a gun, and he got caught and imprisoned briefly. And while he was there, he heard that his buddy Tudor was in the hospital recovering from serious wounds, and they got in touch. The big formation of Tudor's career was on the Western Front in the First World War, where he went into the war as a fairly junior officer, and he came out of the war as the youngest divisional commander in the British Army with all sorts of honors. I think 10 references in dispatches, promoted to major general in the field, and basically covered with glory. He had letters of commendation from Lloyd George and from the head of the whole British operation, the Expeditionary Force. He did quite well in the First World War. So he emerges from the First World War and also was one of the leaders of the occupation in Germany. So he comes home from the First World War in 1919, middle of 1919. And I have photographs. I discovered one of his descendants, a grandson, that he was a very, very normal fellow after 4 years on the Western Front. The photographs are of, classic family situation of wife, kids, backyard. He's doing handstands in one photograph, showing off for the kids about how fit he was. And, a fairly normal human being considering what he'd just come back from. Once he goes to Ireland, there is a complete personality change, a complete behavioral change. His family saw very little of him while he was in Ireland, and by the time he was finished in Ireland in 1922, he was estranged. And by the time, shortly thereafter, he demanded from his wife a divorce, which caught her completely by surprise. She knew that Ireland was not a normal part of his career. Ireland was damaging to the family relationship, but she did not expect this demand for divorce. So everything in his personal life had collapsed by 1922, and the only change in his existence was going to Ireland to deal with his insurgency.
Do we, I mean, there's so little kind of like documentation or evidence or interviews or anything that we could kind of point to as like hard fact to back up a claim. But like, do we have any type of do we have any reason to believe he might have been like guilty or perhaps traumatized by what he did and saw in Ireland?
Well, he was certainly, to use a word that one of his colleagues in Dublin used, embittered. He was embittered. And I think that undermined his entire sort of professionalism. He brought over a little team of people who were close to him on the Western Front, soldiers that he greatly admired, officers, most of them, and he brought them in as to be district commissioners for the Irish Constabulary, located in various parts of Ireland. The fellow he put in the hottest spot, which was Cork, Colonel Smythe, he was very, very special to Tudor. He was a very highly decorated and successful officer in the British Army in the First World War. He made a rather intemperate speech to a bunch of Irish constables shortly after he got to Ireland, in which he basically said, and I'll paraphrase him, but not unfairly, anybody that you suspect of being a rebel or a sympathizer with Sinn Féin, shoot him, and you'll get innocent people occasionally, but we'll back you up. This was the message. He made that in the presence of a room full of Irish police officers, and they did not react the way he expected them to react. And one in particular quit on the spot. And a few days later, the report of this man's outburst in Listowel, it appeared in the Irish newspapers in Cork and in Dublin. And the report of that essentially marked this particular officer for death. He was very close to Tudor, and sure enough, within a few weeks, the man was assassinated in Cork, in the Cork County Club, which was supposedly a loyalist enclave, perfectly safe. The staff were very, very carefully screened so that no radicals got in, but they missed one. One radical told the local IRA brigade that this Smythe was in the club, and he was staying there, and he led the boys into the club one Saturday night, and they shot him. His brother was another artillery friend of Tudor's, who was in the British Army, and he at the time was stationed in Egypt. He decided that he was going to get transferred to Ireland and become part of Tudor's team. And he was going to find whoever killed his brother and take his vengeance. So he gets moved into Dublin, and he gets assigned to a particularly rough squad of Dublin, sort of mix of police and soldiers that were running around breaking down doors and grabbing people off the streets if they suspected them of being too sympathetic. He lasted about 6 weeks, and they got him. He was in a shootout in Dublin, and he came out on the wrong end of the shootout. And he was gone. So there's 2 big funerals for Tudor to attend after, in the first few months on the job. Both of them highly admired. And for both of these people, he felt a particular kind of responsibility because he was responsible for getting them there. And you can see after that, a complete kind of wildness creeps into his management of the RIC, creeps into the tactics that he's using. He becomes an apologist for even the worst of the behavior. He couldn't even, and it's not all his fault. The world now knows about Bloody Sunday and the assassination of 16 or so British, mostly military officers, and the Croke Park massacre that same afternoon, where 16 or so perfectly innocent civilians, including 3 children and a football player, were murdered by the police in Croke Park, Dublin. He was nominally, he was the man accountable for that stuff. for the Croke Park. And he was in a position to have prevented it. He did not, and he was never called to account for it. So, on the one hand, the British government is saying, you've got to be careful of the political optics here. We can't have you going completely crazy. We expect you to manage the police officers with some diligence. And at the same time, we expect you to do the job that you're doing and to achieve what you're achieving, which is to terrorize the Irish to the point where they're going to sort of give up on this mad escapade. So he's getting two signals all the time from London. Do your job, just exactly what you're doing, but be careful of the political fallout from it. Especially, they were particularly alarmed by the fallout in the United States, because there was a large Irish diaspora in the States at the time, very influential. And De Valera, a lot of the top IRA or Sinn Féin officers were active in the United States at the time, raising money, having meetings, holding big rallies with influential Irish Americans, and gathering a lot of political and monetary support for the rising back home. So, and the Irish in America were particularly sensitive. Lloyd George wrote in his diary after the everything settled down. He felt that the Irish sensitivity and outrage in the United States was one of the reasons why the United States was so late getting in on the First World War. That politically, the First World War was considered to be in the States a British war, and the British were the bad guys in this fight back home. So for the American politicians, it was a very delicate situation, and it was constantly coming up in British cabinet meetings between Churchill, Lloyd George, and some of the hawks that really wanted to come down harder on the Irish. But they had to always keep in mind the peril of American intervention. And at one point, Churchill actually raised his fear that the intervention could become an act of American involvement in the Irish War of Independence. And that would be a disaster, he said, for the world. You'd have another world war. And that's how delicate it was. And that is why, on the one hand, they said, do what you're doing, we approve. With the other hand, keep looking over your shoulder, and for God's sake, keep us out of it. We cannot have blood splatter on us, Churchill and Lloyd George particularly. So do it, but do it with some kind of prudence. So he just did it without prudence, to the point where the overall British strategy, which was not necessarily to wipe out the IRA or to wipe out Sinn Féin it was to brutalize them to the point where they would sit down and talk about a longer term relationship, which turned out to be a treaty, which was basically the outcome of this Irish War, and a treaty that the British rammed basically down the throats of these inexperienced Irish negotiators, and managed to spark a civil war back in Ireland, so they could then sit back and watch the Irish kill one another, and they could move on with their management of the British Empire.
Speaking of Churchill there, it would be fair to say that Tudor felt like any scrutiny from like cabinet and government, that he would be shielded by Churchill for this.
He and Churchill were very, very friendly on a personal basis. There were young army officers in India in the 1890s. Right from that point on, there was a mutual admiration going on there. Churchill was from this distinguished British line of politicians and military heroes, and was destined for great things in his own career. Tudor, and in spite of the fact that he had the same name as Henry VIII, same surname, he was from a very simple middle-class English family. His father was an Anglican clergyman. His relatives were mostly either in religion or trade. His prospects in life were going to be limited, but as for many young people of that time, the British Army offered a fast track into prominence, especially if you could land a good war. So he lands out in India. He and Churchill become pals. Churchill was always very sort of taken with physicality and violence. And here was Tudor, who was a soldier, who was also a very competent boxer. He won the British Army title twice in the 1890s. He was a horseman. Churchill was a horseman. They played polo all the time over there when they had they got along very well. So when Churchill recruited Tudor to go to Ireland to run the police, it was on the basis of a profound trust. This was a man who would be absolutely discreet about what we were doing. He would be absolutely loyal and dutiful, would do everything we wanted to the max. And he was absolutely trustworthy to Churchill. And Churchill repaid him up to a point where he would apologize for him. He would cover Tudor's back in cabinet and in various meetings where people were beginning to ask, especially the British Army, were not the senior officers of the British Army for complicated reasons, but they didn't like Tudor. He had too much clout. He overshadowed the army position in Ireland. The army was sort of the main agent of British control in Ireland. But here comes this fellow Tudor, who agrees to dress up like a policeman and to run a police force to do what the army thought that they should probably be doing. So he had enemies in the army, and Churchill stood up for him. Churchill was the Minister of War, so he had a lot of clout. So yeah, Churchill looked after the man up until the point in about the middle of getting down into the middle of 1921. Churchill ceases to be the Minister of War. He becomes a colonial secretary. So he's now, the army is basically telling the prime minister, keep him away from here now. Keep Churchill out of this. He doesn't have the hat anymore. Keep him away. So, but Lloyd George was up to his neck in the same sort of management conspiracy that Churchill was. So the two of them continued to run it. And this is, to me, I mean, this is maybe a bit of overinterpretation on my part. The one thing that reined in Churchill more effectively than anything else was the opinion of his wife, Clementine. Clementine, at some point, when this was at its dirtiest, when reprisals against Irish communities and Irish individuals was now an official policy of the British government, Clementine wrote a letter. She was on a holiday in France, and she writes a letter to my dear Winston. And she basically, in modern parlance of relationships, Winston, you're better than that. I can't believe that you're signing on to that kind of a punish policy. You're behaving like the enemy in the First World War. You know, you're burning down innocent people's houses, and you're destroying libraries, and you're killing people. And these reprisals, as she said, they bring the rain down on the innocent as well as the guilty. Will you please stop that? Will you please stop listening to people like the Irish Secretary of State and the rest of them in that cabinet? I haven't seen any record of how he responded directly to her, but you can see in the cabinet meetings over the next 4 or 5 weeks, Churchill starts to swing around until eventually he's voting for a ceasefire. He's arguing in favor of treaty negotiations, even while the prime minister is still the big hawk. So there's a separation of certain priorities between him and Lloyd George. And I give Clementine Churchill full marks for that. And it's inevitably the shooting starts to die down and the negotiations begin. And the Irish independence movement gets shafted probably more desperately in peace talks than they ever did on the battle.
In terms of like these kind of more specific instances, the ones that really stand out: burning of Cork in mid-December 1920, sack of Balbriggin in towards the end of September. Like how much of the decision to go and do those things can we lay at Tudor's feet, as opposed to him just kind of letting them get on with their what they wanted to do?
in terms of leadership, uh, that's a big thing to lay at Tudor's feet. The fact that he not only allowed it to go on, but he in a way encouraged it by telling these policemen, ex former soldiers, "I got your back." He defended them in the most in terrible cases. There was the two young innocent that were basically civilians that were picked up at night in Dublin, and they were murdered by a couple of Tudor's men. Put up against a wall and shot. They were taken in for questioning, and then okay, you guys get nothing on you. We're going to drive you home, and they stopped on the way home. They shot them down. There was a big uproar over that. Tudor defended his officers. There was after the burning of Cork, he defended the auxiliary police that did that. He defended one of them who actually shortly after the burning of Cork, the auxiliary body that was held responsible was moved about 20 miles away to another place to keep them out of the line of inquiry. And one of them murdered a priest and an innocent boy on the roadside over there. And once again, Tudor would do everything in his power to shield them from accountability. So it was a matter of being. I suppose he would say, "I always support my troops," but he did so at the expense of discipline, at the expense of any sort of responsibility. So I don't think there's a time when he ordered people to do these things. And there's an interesting document that turned up late in history after the Irish War, in which Michael Collins had a conversation one night with one of Tudor's closest associates in Dublin Castle. It was during the ceasefire, and they met. The circumstances are complicated, but anyway, they ended up drinking, and in the course of the booze up, Collins actually said that the only real problem he had with the British government in terms of how they attacked his insurgency and how they ran the Royal Irish Constabulary. His big problem was that they would assign what he called the finest British fighting general to go to Ireland and run their campaign there. So he held that against the government as opposed to Tudor himself. Oddly enough, in that session, he said he didn't have a big problem with the Black and Tans. He just saw them doing the work as they figured it to be, and he thought that the auxiliaries were a really effective fighting force. So he was mellowing out at this point. So I think that Tudor, and I've had this conversation with Irish people who challenge my use of the word innocent or what do I call it? Accidental villain. A lot of contemporary Irish say, "What do you mean accidental? What was accidental?" And I said, "Well, what was accidental was the fact that if you're going to make an assessment of moral quality, you have to take account of motivation. What was his motive? His motive was to answer the bugle call of duty and to protect the integrity of the British Empire. And it is factual that the insurrection in Ireland was a threat to the future of the empire. Well, the whole future of the empire was in doubt anyway, but at that particular time, they could imagine it could be preserved for another generation. This uprising in Ireland was setting a bad example for people in India, from the Bengal and Africa, various places. It was creating problems in the United States, and so they had to stamp it out, and he agreed. His entire life was dedicated to the integrity and the reputation and the value to the world of the British Empire. His second motivation was one of personal loyalty to a friend. And those two factors sort of clouded over any consciousness of just the morality of what he was doing in Ireland. He didn't go to Ireland as many of the British officers and soldiers did with a hatred for the Irish. He didn't know anything about their struggle. He didn't know anything about the history. He just said, "This is okay. My country wants me to go in there and sort this thing out for the preservation of everybody, including the Irish. They'd be better off if we get rid of this crowd of criminals that are leading this insurgency." And so this was the mindset he had going in there, as best it can be reproduced now. He wasn't there long before things started to happen that really, to be blunt, drove him around the bend. He became radicalized, he became brutalized, and he became, as Miles put it mildly, embittered. And so he didn't care anymore about the Irish. And whatever happened to them, they brought it on themselves. And he was only using the tactics against them that they were using against him. So I think that he went in there just as a normal veteran, as normal as you could be after the First World War. He went in there as a normal veteran, as a sort of a friend that we can all relate to friendship, and as a loyalist to the country that he had joined to serve when he was a boy. And so he was in there with this kind of naive attitude that he was going to pull this off for the betterment of everybody and then go home again. And he got a big shock. It wasn't possible. So I think that what happened to him, and when you look at the rest of his life, which we haven't got around to, you look at the rest of his life, it was compromised permanently for the next 40 plus years, 50 years, by that 20-month period in Ireland.
Do we have any kind of reason to believe or evidence that could point us towards Churchill or maybe others in the military telling Hugh Tudor in secret, not publicly, but like look, we turn down some of this, like, we'll say very how would you call it? We'll say like what you might call now like terrorist tactics, like the type of stuff they were doing. Was there any? Do we have any reason to believe that he was told like ease it a bit, just for not because we care about the Irish people, but
Yeah.
for our own sake?
There's one very specific and I think historically defensible. He took the Secretary of State for Ireland aside. And in one instance, like he's sitting down and he's patting Tudor on the head and on the back, and "Good work, old boy, you're doing a great job for us." Shortly thereafter, in a meeting with the Irish Secretary of State, Hamar Greenwood, he's saying, "You got to do something about the Black and Tans. You got to get real firm with them." And because we're starting to get bad vibes from the rest of the world. So bring this under control. Do what you have to do. And Hamar Greenwood then takes Tudor aside and threatens to fire him. You will be fired along with a lot of your senior officers if you don't we're not saying stop what you're doing. We're saying just be a bit more prudent. Don't be leaving so many bodies around. Cover it up and keep the politicians out of it, for God's sake. But he was clearly threatened, and Greenwood reported this meeting back to Lloyd George. I've said it in the most strenuous way that if he doesn't clean up his act, he's gone, and that seemed to satisfy Lloyd George for the time being. And so yes, the British government expressed a certain amount of concern about optics. It was always about optics. It wasn't about the bloodshed, and the economic hardships for the British, or the Irish. It wasn't about the fact that the Black and Tans were running around rural Ireland burning down creameries, which were the most important infrastructure in the rural economy, burning down small businesses, knocking on doors in the middle of the night and murdering whoever answers the door because it happened to be a house where Sinn Féin sympathizers lived. there was no big deal about any of that stuff. But the big deal was always about what the rest of the world saw. And it was after you mentioned Balbriggin. It was after that because Balbriggin isn't far from Dublin. When it was happening out in the boondocks, it wasn't really making that much of a difference except in the small communities. But then when you started, started happening in places like Balbriggin and around Dublin, the rest of the world started to come in. Newspaper people were coming in from France, coming in from Canada, and in the United States, and it was suddenly becoming a big international story. The slow, pathetic death of, I never quite know whether it's McSweeney or McSweeney, the mayor of Cork, who was picked up and arrested for no good reason. But he was an IRA activist, and he went on a hunger strike. And after about 70 days, they foolishly moved him from Cork to London for imprisonment. And of course, people found out when he was there, and suddenly pictures of him started to appear in foreign media. And before you know it, he was a big international celebrity. And the British refused to take this imagery seriously. The guy wasted away and eventually died of starvation. Shortly thereafter, they executed Kevin Barry, who was a teenager who was accused of shooting some British officers. He was in a raid. He was the only one they caught. 3 British soldiers were killed in the raid. Kevin Barry took the rap for it all. He refused to defend himself in court because he didn't recognize the court. So they hanged him. And they hanged him a few days after McSweeney died. And on the 1st of November, which was the holiest day in the year in Ireland, where every Catholic and every priest is in church, and every priest, even the moderates, even the conservative priests, are decrying this crime on a holy day. Hang an young Irish medical student. And after allowing this eloquent and distinguished and gentle IRA mayor of Cork to die of starvation in front of the whole world. So this was a big turning point. After this, the optics of the whole Irish thing started to get very sensitive. And then I believe the government started to sort of put a little bit more pressure on Tudor. There was a famous case where there was a young woman sitting with her infant child on her lap. And I can't remember the name of the place, but Yeats wrote a poem in which he made a reference to it. A truckload of tens was driving by. They were shooting off, which they used to like to do. They'd drive around the countryside in the small towns, firing weapons in the air. They killed her as she sat there with the child on her lap. This did not look good on the British, and they became extremely sensitive. They sent out a notification a couple of days later to Tudor saying you have to prepare instructions for the people if they're going to be firing guns to be more careful where they're pointing. So Tudor sends out an ambiguous all points bulletin. This is not right. Your instructions are. I don't blame you for shooting people. I mean, you're under a lot of pressure. You're going to be shooting people. That's your job. But for God's sake, shoot the person that you're aiming at. Don't be firing wildly and shooting people that just happen to be in the neighborhood. So there were a number of incidents like that that suddenly increased the international attention to the Irish War was getting tense. And as it ratcheted up, the British government just got more and more desperate, and they agreed to sit down and talk to the Irish. The outcome of that, we're still dealing with the fallout from that to this very day, which was an unsatisfactory, a settlement that was unsatisfactory to a very large part of Ireland. And it still is unsatisfactory to a very large part of Ireland.
It's worth mentioning as well, like from the position of the IRA in the War of Independence, and from other such we'll say like other guerrilla groups who are trying to shake off like a foreign oppressor. You don't really need to you don't need to like defeat the army in the wood that in the way they would in other wars. You just kind of have to cause like enough of an inconvenience to make it not worth it for them.
And that was the part of the assignment that Tudor didn't quite understand. He didn't know that subtlety. That the end of this war was not necessarily going to be a victory march. End of this war was going to be a bunch of men in suits sitting in a small room, coming up with ideas about how to go forward and make as many people as possible happy. And that's the way it ended. And he was very confused by this. He was really quite confused, and never mind the fact that he really had no place in the world where he could consider himself to be safe because of the time he spent with the Black and Tans. And so, this particular point, Churchill tried to protect him by sending him off Palestine with a large number, I think 700 or 800 Black and Tan, vulnerable Black and Tan police officers to set up a little police force over there to keep the Arabs and the Jewish settlers from each other's throats. He got over there. That worked fine. It wasn't really as challenging. He said compared to Ireland, it was a rest cure. And he should be there now. But no rest cure today. But anyway, while he was there, people were so terrified of him and those police officers that they kind of backed away from each other. After a little while, he was there about 2 years when the Lloyd George coalition collapsed. There was an election, and Churchill, for the first time in decades, was out of office. So Tudor, and the new crowd did not like Tudor. They wanted to get rid of him, and they did. So in 1922, 23, for the first time in his adult life, he was unemployed, and he had no place to go. He had destroyed his family. He had destroyed his reputation in the British Army. Ireland was definitely not a place he could go. Sir Henry Wilson, who was above him, Field Marshal, British officer who was very outspoken about Irish affairs, was assassinated on his doorstep in Belgravia. There was no place that Hugh Tudor could feel that he would be safe. And so I don't know how far down this road you want to go, but he ended up going back to London and moving into one place where he could be for a while safe, which was the old Army and Navy club in London. He moved in there with a bunch of old people like himself, ex-Army, ex-Navy. And while he was there, somebody came up with the scheme that there was a safe place in North America for him and that he should go there. And he did.
I was going to say, ironically, for a man who was involved in wars in so many different continents, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe again, for a man who was in so many war zones, he actually lived to like his mid-90s. Ironically enough, can you tell us the IRA, not for lack of trying, never actually did manage to kill him,
no,
but became relatively close from him?
This is one of them funniest. If you consider it funny, he was on a hit list for a very long time. The place he chose to settle was Newfoundland. Now, for your crowd, I don't know if you know anything about Newfoundland. It is a very large rock in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. Beautiful people, mostly of Irish extraction. But Newfoundland in the First World War had the distinction of putting its own local regiment in, Royal Newfoundland Regiment. And the battalion from that regiment served under Tudor in the 9th Scottish Infantry Division when he was a good soldier. And they distinguished themselves with great valor. So they knew him. One of the boys, he wasn't even 17-year-old member of this battalion, won the Victoria Cross for gallantry. So in this small community of Newfoundlanders, still fewer than 1 million people in the place, Tudor was a respected military leader. Even though most of them were, large number of the Newfoundlanders are Irish Catholics, That didn't matter. He was the leader of the Royal Irish Regiment Battalion in the First World War, and he did a good job. And the soldiers respected him and liked him. So he went there. They set him up with a little job in the fishery, marketing salt fish, which he knew nothing about. But he went there. He settled in. He lived there for over 40 years, and he died there and is buried there now. Now the story you're referring to is it's just one of those. As I say in the book, it was gossip. It was a rumor too delicious not to swallow. Because according to the rumor, at some point in the late 40s, early 50s, two Irish uh, patriots went to Newfoundland with instructions to kill him. And one of them unwisely mentioned it to an Irish priest. And the Irish priest was a bit shocked and went to the Archbishop. The Archbishop arranged for a quick extradition. These people were like gathered, collected, and sent out and told it's easy enough to get here as visitors. It's really difficult to get away as fugitives. So just go home and consider your job over and you're done. And that story has survived. I've spent a lot of time trying to validate it, trying to nail it down. And there are one of Tudor's surviving friends, very close to him, a woman who is now 103. She swears it's true. But I believe that this was a story that she and Tudor cooked up to create this image of untouchability about him. You can come looking for him, but you're not going to get him. And right around this same time, one of the documents I discovered in my work was an application to the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary for permission to own and carry a handgun. And on the application form, he always carried a handgun. But Newfoundland had joined Canada as a province and came under the Canadian Criminal Code, which requires people to not have handguns, but if you do you have to have special permission. So he had applied in the early 50s for permission to have the handgun and to carry it. And on the form where it says reasons for wanting to carry a handgun, he says personal protection. So he still felt vulnerable then. This woman who is still alive, 103 years old now, she told me that he also had a little gun. I don't know if anybody is familiar with this. It's a gun that you can hold in the palm of your hand, palm gun, they call it. And it shoots by squeezing it. The barrel sticks out between your fingers, and if you squeeze your hand, it fires a bullet. He had one of those in one pocket. He had the revolver in the other pocket, the Webley. And on top of that, my informant, my 100-year-old informant says, and I've got his brass knuckles up in my room. So he was well equipped to defend himself if anything arose on the streets. So if the two Irishmen did come over to kill him, it was their good luck that they didn't try, because it would have been a bad outcome. That story is still going. Like, there's this woman with his brass knuckles still say, yes, that's absolutely true. They came to get him, and the Archbishop sent them packing.
Wow. So okay, yeah. I mean, he did survive, but my God, he seemed to have his dying day being afraid and being worried about a blowback.
Exactly, living in a place. I think he had a son. His one son visited him in Newfoundland. His brother, who was working in Canada for a while, would pass through there, visited him once. That was all he had by way of family connection for 40-some years. And when he died, the woman that I'm talking about with his brass knuckles, she arranged his funeral. And she notified the family in England, the 4 surviving kids, your dad died. You're not that far away. Come on over. We're having his funeral. And they all replied, we're not going. Unable to attend. So and it's interesting, he died 9 months, almost to the day after Churchill died. So if you sit and you compare the two funerals, Churchill, who set him up on the course that led him to where he died, Churchill's funeral in January that year, to which he was invited, but he couldn't go, too old. Churchill's funeral is like, I'm told that it attracted a larger television audience than Kennedy's in the United States a few months earlier. Churchill's was a massive display of pomp. And a few months later, Tudor dies in Newfoundland. And the woman, the brass knuckles lady, she got him set up in a funeral home, and she sat by his open casket for hours waiting for somebody to come and visit. And over in the other corner, she says there was a little casket with a child in it, and it was open. So here he is. He's laid out in this pathetic little funeral home, a place he had never heard of till he got there. And she said gradually they trickled in. These are the old army veterans trickled in. And I have a photograph of his graveside ceremony, and there are 6 people in the picture. One of them is the minister. So if you compare how the friendship starts in India between these two men, how it evolves, Churchill becomes one of the great statesmen, historic figures of the 20th century, credited with holding the world together in the Second World War. Tudor lives out half of his life sitting on a cold and foggy rock in the middle of the North Atlantic, looking over his shoulder. And he was treated with great respect. Privacy was respected. But I try to imagine what kind of a life that was for him. And I'm sure every Irish person that's familiar with his record would say it's more than he deserved.
I was going to say very tough to feel sympathetic.
And I don't get me wrong, John, because I was driving around not too long ago, and I went to, it was a hard story to pin down in enough detail for a book. And I found the lady who knew him personally, who's still alive, and I found his grandson who was in England, and he was very helpful. But I'm saying to myself, what if I could have actually gone and interviewed him, spent some time talking to him? What would I have thought of? And I finally concluded from what I've been able to ascertain about his character, which is sketchy, but he was a bigot. He was a racist. He was an imperialist. He was a snob. I would not have liked this man. I would have held my nose if, in fact, and he would never have talked to me. But let's say by some miracle he had decided to talk to me. I'd have held my nose, and I'd have done. I used to be a journalist. That's what you do. But I would not have liked him, and I would not have gone out of my way to maintain any kind of a connection with him. So, yeah, it's very difficult to feel sorry for him. When you read some of the documents from the Irish War period, the only one, he never wrote a memoir. He never kept a diary in Ireland. He didn't correspond with anybody in Ireland except possibly with Churchill. He corresponded with Churchill over the years, so you get a lot of insight from that. But while they were in Ireland, they both had reasons to sort of keep it under the table. And so he basically was an enigma. But you can get enough knowledge about him that you don't get the impression of a very attractive human being, and you get the impression of someone who was not unfamiliar to the Third Reich and who subsequently said, I was just following orders. And to bring it closer to here and now, I'm watching what's happening in the United States with the ICE raids and the Border Patrol raids and these big men in combat gear running around cities trying to enforce the laws as opposed to fight wars. And I ask myself, what will the future say about them? Will they be the black and tans remembered in the future? And will grandchildren be saying, I saw something on television the other evening about 2025. Was that what you were doing then, Grandpa? And it'll be a hard question to answer, as it is now with anybody. Hey, Granddad, I heard that you were an Irish policeman in 1921. Were you one of tans? Were you a tan, Granddad? What does Granddad say? Yes, I was, but I was working in the office. I was just doing paperwork.
Very good. To wrap it all up, thank you very much for everything you shared. I suggest, obviously, if anyone has listened this far, there's way more detail in the book. Obviously, if you like what you've heard, you'll love the book. Just to kind of wrap it up, how did you come to the point where you were so interested in this that you
Well,
took on the journey of
yeah,
writing a book about it?
it's interesting. 1941, there was a summit conference between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. 1941 was a bad time in Churchill's war because he was losing. The Allies were losing the Second World War. The Americans weren't in it. So Churchill and Roosevelt had this meeting, and to have the meeting, they went halfway between London and Washington, which was the south coast of Newfoundland. So they're talking about what can we do to win this war, and what can we do afterwards to create an international environment where these kinds of wars don't happen. And the upshot of that was the United Nations. So these two guys are sitting on a battleship off the south coast of Newfoundland, surrounded by 24 other battleships to protect them. And they're having this conversation. And in the middle of it, Churchill says to his staff, I got a friend not far from here in St. John's, Newfoundland. Somebody get a hold of him. I want you to bring him over here and we can have lunch. I'll send a float plane to get him. And so they went looking for Hugh Tudor. So I was reading some kind of an academic document about this meeting, and there was a footnote saying the person that he wanted to bring over for lunch was Major General Sir Hugh Tudor, who he knew from early days as soldiers and who had served as a commander of the Royal Irish Constabulary in the Irish War. What? What's he doing in Newfoundland? How come nobody writes about him? How come I've never seen a book about this fellow? I read 50 books about Ireland and the wars, and I've seen the footnote. Once I went back into the references, yeah, there's footnotes here and there, Tudor, always in a negative context. So I realized very quickly on, this is a fellow who went out of his way to avoid being remembered. He had himself erased from history for a good reason. So I wanted to find out what the reason was. And then I quickly realized he did not ever want to be written about. He did not write about himself, and he just wanted to vanish, which he almost did. And as a result of that, I just dug in deeper and deeper and deeper. The story was compelling to me, and I felt compelled to find out as much as possible. A publisher said, "Wow, that sounds like a good story," and give it to me. So I did. It turned COVID broke out. You couldn't get into an archive. You couldn't get into a library. You couldn't get on an airplane for a while. I managed, so I survived COVID, and I wrote the book. And like you say, it's a good story. It's told with a sort of a narrative flavor, and anybody who wants one, you can get them on Amazon, or you'll get them.
Very good. Yeah, I'll include a link in the description in both the podcast and the YouTube. Yeah, people can get it there. Any more books in the pipeline that might relate to Ireland or War of Independence or anything?
Nothing direct. I mean, Irish. There's one. I'm working on a novel about a university professor who got the nickname the Deacon. Nobody knows why he's got the nickname the Deacon. When he gets into a whole bunch of situations and his history is revealed, he was studying to be a Roman Catholic priest and quit a month or so before ordination when he was a deacon. And he went on and he became a university professor. And he put it all behind him. And life, as frequently happens, started to reappear in the present reality. So it's a novel. It's a fiction. It's a work of fiction. I'm not going to write another nonfiction because I'm too old and too weary after the last one.
Very good. Thank you very much for everything you've shared. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, for anyone who's enjoyed this, you'll love the book. I'll put a link. I'll put a link below.
Okay, John. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.